Today on the Wrestling Roundtable, UFC, the SEG years, and looking back at Randy Couture's career. Welcome to the Wrestling Roundtable. I'm the host, Eric Santamaria. Been a fan of mixed martial arts for quite some time, 15 years, but I've been working in pro wrestling, and yes, this is the Wrestling Roundtable. I'm well aware of it, but before everyone jumps away and closes the video or thumbs us down, some pro wrestling fans have made the jump. Obviously, there's a parallel here. UFC's gotten a lot of wrestling fans over the years, not only just being positioned with The Ultimate Fighter after Raw when it was on TNN or Spike TV, but also because of Brock Lesnar. So we do have some fans who watch both. Some fans who maybe are kind of newer but don't really know too much. So instead of going away, use this as an opportunity maybe to learn some more about the history of mixed martial arts, UFC in its early years, by Semaphore Entertainment Group, starting it off in November 1993. And we're going to talk about up until it was bought by Zuffa in January 2001. There is a term actually in UFC for getting a wrestling fan to become an MMA fan. They call it graduating in their marketing department. So let's see if some of you can graduate now and use this as your springboard. But introducing the panel, Rodney LeConte to my right, which is your left. He's been a fan of MMA for 15 years. Find out more about his latest projects on RodneyLeConteFilms.com. Also to my right, which is your left, Will Brooks. Been a fan of MMA 11 years, and he's in our chat room at WrestlingRoundtable.com every Monday night during Raw. To my left, which is your right, Orlando O'Neill. Fan of MMA of 8 years, and also a fan of Wrestling Roundtable, just like Will Brooks. So fans coming aboard is what it's all about, sharing ideas, and right now I want to go a little backwards to the early days of UFC. Obviously, from when they started in 93 in really unregulated states like Wyoming and Colorado, and as it changed and progressed over the years to get more mainstream and become really the sport that it is today, they made some changes. But going back to those early shows, which you and I remember watching, not just on TV and renting the videos at the local VHS store, if you remember those antiquated items, was UFC, when it started off, too brutal for its own good?
By today's standards, yes, it'd be too brutal, but I think that was the intention that they were trying to bring across to the masses, because they just wanted to bring a style of who is a better fighter. You watch boxing, you watch people gloves, and then people have their own martial arts, but everyone's mind always wanted to see, can Mike Tyson beat Chuck Norris in a real fight? Can Muhammad Ali fight in a real fight Bruce Lee? Yeah. So you always kind of wondered what would happen if a boxer fought a karate guy or if a wrestler fought this guy. So to see it actually culminate was something special. Was it too brutal? Like I said, by today's standards, yes, but back then they didn't sugarcoat it. They basically said this is 100% real. I would say no.
There was no gloves, there was hair pulling, groin shots. It was more spectacle than sport, as it's been called, and it was kind of like a blood sport or Jean-Claude Van Damme movie in a way. And I don't think when Rorion Gracie and Art Davie and WOW were getting together to form this one night intended tournament that they knew it was going to springboard into something else. So do you think it was too much for one night, or was that what they intended?
I think it's what they intended. That's what fighting is. It's kicks, it's punches, it's elbows, it's knees, it's submissions. You're going to break your limbs, you're going to crack your knuckles, you're going to get bloody, and you're going to get hurt. But that's fighting. That's martial arts. That's what they intended to be. As real as it gets. That was a tagline they put on the tape.
When you can grab a man's nuts and have him submit by doing that, I just think that's too
much.
Hey, whatever works for you, man.
But
that gets into the human cockfighting territory, as John McCain put it.
Yeah, and that's why they didn't last too long during those early years, but I do think it was a little too brutal. But again, they were trying to see exactly which fighting style was the best, and we all saw who won the first one. It was Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which is still pretty strong in the MMA world today.
It might have been brutal, but there was an audience for it. There's an audience who comes out to see the blood, to see good fights. When there's a fight, when you're out and there's a fight, people run to see a fight.
But it was also, back then at least, more lowest common denominator, like Ken Shamrock would submit somebody by breaking his ankle, and because it wasn't a kick or a punch or bloody, the fans booed it. And
because they didn't know. Just because they didn't know. Once UFC 3 came along, everyone was pretty much on the Hoist Gracie bandwagon when he was submitting guys. So people just didn't know what was happening.
But of the people that did watch, some of us were among them. What attracted you to it, though? If it was so brutal and so freak show, what appealed to you about
the fact that it was real fighting. You know, I remember in '96, one of my classmates, we were in the technology room, so we had TVs and VCRs. He's talking to me about this Ultimate Fighting stuff. I'm like, no, what is it? Something about it just intrigued me. I think it was just the fact that it was real fighting, that these guys weren't just street thugs, they were actually trained in
Some of them were.
but they still held their own. And it's the fact that it was what we always wanted to see. Which style of fighting, which discipline is the best? Put all these guys together in interesting situations, and I was just interested to see the outcome.
But we grew up on pro wrestling, so we saw what it looked like when fighting was choreographed and people were cooperating with each other. But this was like real life Street Fighter.
I gotta agree with him. Style versus style was really the biggest appeal for me. Exactly. Would an American wrestler beat a guy who was a kickboxer, or would a boxer be able to beat a guy who was a karate guy? That was the appeal to me, at least early on.
And I was like, wow, this is like WWF come to real life. That was my mentality at that point.
Right. Well, over the next several years, we saw it unfold in different sort of formats and tournaments and different kind of events with different names and whatnot. But obviously, if you look back now, like if we watch an old UFC fight, you can't believe some of the shit that they're doing. I guess we're so used to it being regulated and being controlled to a certain degree as a sport. But looking at it now, it's like, wow, I can't believe this went on. That being said, there is something that obviously attracted people to it. So what about today? Are there any elements from the old school UFC that you'd like to see maybe brought back?
Not so much. I actually like the UFC as it is now. It's grown to be a great organization. I think back then it was just too wild, too rowdy, and I think it was kind of like a niche audience. But I think now it's actually grown to an actual legit sport. Nowadays, I actually like the UFC a lot more. I mean, it's fun to watch the old UFC just to see how crazy it is, all the stupid and crazy stuff they did. The UFC, how it is nowadays, is a lot better.
One of the things actually I would like to see come back would be the outfits, because as far as strict disciplines go, when GSP comes out in a gi, wouldn't it be interesting to see him actually fight in one like Hoist Gracie did back then? Jiu-Jitsu guys wearing a gi?
No, I wouldn't see that at all, because when you train with the gi, it's a whole different world than training without a gi. You get the whole thing was unfair advantage. I'd rather just see it in the shorts, everyone on the fair playing ground.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to see brought back?
I'd like to see a Dominic Gracie in UFC. I think that would be something. The way they ran MMA or Ultimate Fighting back then in the late 90s, I thought it was pretty good. I also would like to see one-night tournaments. I know it's hard because of injuries and everything. And even back then, some guys couldn't go on forward because of injuries. But I think now it's possible. It wouldn't get regulated, but I think it's possible.
I think Chris Lieben could do well in one of those.
Yeah.
I kind of miss the old school style versus style. Sometimes you still hear like, oh, the classic striker versus grappler, but they're so few and far between.
Yeah.
But then also ground attacks. You can't hit a guy with his hands on the ground or whatever. Screw that. The guy put his hand on the ground so you wouldn't hit him. Well, screw you. I'm going to hit you anyway. I miss that. I mean, I'm not talking about
Well,
the
in
head.
Japan, you could do that.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the old school head stomps. That's, you know,
Oh, no,
I don't want.
I am. I want to see Pride rules come back, not in a video game.
I kind of want one of those. But like, you know, I'm talking about ground strikes. I wish they were more open-minded with the ground strikes.
Well, that's why I think, as far as disciplines go, that people like Lyoto Machida so much, because he was kind of a throwback in a way to the old days. Here's a karate guy coming up, and you don't really see that anymore. And even when you're driving around town, you don't see too many strict discipline schools anymore. A karate school, a taekwondo school. You're seeing a mixed martial arts school. So in that sense, MMA is becoming its own discipline with just a little bit of elements from everybody. And I think that's why guys like Anthony Pettis or John Jones stand out, because they're not the typical MMA fighter. Everyone's got like the same repertoire of 10 moves or whatever, and it generally is the same vicinity that people stay within. Whereas these guys bring out kicks off the wall like Mortal Kombat, or spinning back elbows, stuff that's off the wall, well, literally off the wall with Anthony Pettis. But that's what I kind of miss about it. I miss the pure discipline, guys that were strict boxers, strict taekwondo. And obviously that's not going to really work in the modern day, but I do kind of miss that a little bit. The other thing that I also wish that they would do once in a while is, I'll relate it to something that almost happened. You know how Hoist Gracie was saying that he wants his retirement fight to be in Brazil this August when they return there? Who were one of the guys that wanted to take him up on his retirement fight?
Dan Severn.
Dan Severn. Of course, a rematch from the old UFC days, but that would never happen now because they're in completely different weight classes. So I would like, once in a while, not necessarily a catch weight, but open weight. I'd love to see an open weight freak show fight once in a while myself. It could be a lightweight against a heavyweight.
Like a Bono.
Yeah.
I'd like to see Brock Lesnar destroy Uriah Faber.
Well, we're going to talk some more about the old school UFC days, SEG years, when we come back. Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. If you have anything to add, some memories of the SEG years for UFC, give us a call on Wrestling Roundtable Radio, 347-857-4647, Tuesdays at 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. Pacific, on Blog Talk Radio. And be sure to visit WrestlingRoundtable.com. You can find the links to all of our past shows, and including our podcast. Go to iTunes, type in Wrestling Roundtable or WrestlingRoundtablePodcast.com. Wherever you're listening or watching to us, just please remember to share, rate, comment, and subscribe. And now our look back at the Semaphore Entertainment Group, starting off UFC before it got sold to Zuffa a few years later, continues. And we were just talking about some of the elements that we might want to see come back. However, they did need to change a lot of them to become a sport, become more mainstream, and not have to do all their shows in Wyoming. So, of all the changes that they made over the next few years building up to the Zuffa purchase, what were some of the changes that you thought were really the way to go?
Weight classes and gloves. Automatically right there. I mean, Tank Abbott was the one that started coming out with the gloves. It's just necessary to protect the fighters. I think they started realizing there were too many injuries, too many fighters backing out of tournaments that they would have liked to move on. Too many last-minute replacements. Boxing has gloves and weight classes. They saw what boxing was doing. It was the right thing to do. Because when you have Anthony Macias going against a 250-pound Dan Severn, it just wasn't fair.
You ever put on a UFC glove?
Yeah.
The 4 ounces one?
Yeah.
It's like barely having a glove, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's like a step up from tape.
Exactly. But you know, with bare fists, it just looks brutal.
I understand.
Exactly.
But I'm just saying, like, if being a 4-ounce glove, maybe that's why we see so many broken hands.
Doing a better job of ref stoppages. That was a really...
What ref stoppages? Like, the first show, you're like, he just tapped out. And because they were using boxing refs who didn't know what that was, like, Hoist is going to kill that guy.
Yeah. Ref stoppages were really a great add to like, what the sport needed to be.
Rounds in the fights, because back then
you just keep going.
A lot of the fights were stopped early, but then some of the fights like the
went on forever.
Yeah, like what was that? Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn. They fought for like a half hour. Nobody wants to see two guys laying on the ground for a half hour.
Oleg Tektarov and Tank Abbott in the finals of the tournament at UFC 6 was 15 minutes of Tektarov doing nothing.
Yeah.
Like, at least they could stand him up now,
Yeah.
but there was no breaks back then. So let's not forget, of course, groin shots, elbows to the back of the head, hair pulling, so much of that.
Eye gouging.
Those are the only rules. There's no eye gouging, no
there's
fish
no eye
hooking.
Of all these fights that progressed, we saw eventually guys like Mark Coleman would come in and innovate the ground and pound style. Jens Pulver, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture. Guys like that started coming in after a few years and really changing the dynamic of everything. A lot of the background of those guys was wrestling. However, Rorion Gracie intended for the UFC to be a showcase of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which was very successful with Royce Gracie, of course, in a lot of those tournaments. So I've mentioned 2 styles so far, mostly ground-based. What style do you think really stuck out, maybe is one of the strongest? They wanted the answer, which style is the best?
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It really showed in the first 4 UFCs. People talk about fighters today, what guy is the UFC? Royce Gracie. I mean, it just showed how this guy, smallest guy in competition, could beat guys twice his size, implementing a style that no one's seen before, using arms and choking people off his back, and just shows that if he gets taken down, he's still dangerous, and it's a way to protect yourself against people striking on top of you. That and what you mentioned before, Mark Coleman really implementing his ground and pound. I mean, they really upped their credibility when they brought in a national wrestler like Dan Severn. Yeah. But Mark Coleman took wrestling and brought it to a whole new level with its relentless ground and pound, and that's why they call him the Godfather of ground and pound. But I think those 2 styles you still see a lot today.
But those are ground-based, and every fight starts on its feet. Do you think it makes a difference, or when they take him down, then it's game over?
Well, back then you saw as soon as they took him down, it was pretty much game over. But I think now everybody's so well-rounded that it pretty much doesn't matter, that everybody's training in a whole bunch of different styles. But I think pretty much what the guys of today are using a lot of wrestling and jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which goes back to the original UFC and shows that Gracie jiu-jitsu was very important, and also, like he was saying, Dan Severn, Mark Coleman's wrestling ground and pound. So I think those are the great styles.
I agree. American wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. American wrestlers dominated a lot of the early UFC after like the Gracies were gone.
But we did see when Severn fought Royce Gracie at UFC 4, I believe it was, he took him down, sure, but he had no idea really how to finish him, and then Gracie eventually tapped him in a triangle.
UFC 4, though, American wrestlers really were the dominant forces.
But they had to add elements.
They have to add submission, defense and everything like that.
But it seemed
And
like wrestlers were the guys who like were running the UFC for a while.
They're saying that now, though, because people even today, between Koscheck, Lesnar, GSP, who didn't wrestle up until he started training in MMA, still uses wrestling as his base. They're saying wrestling is the base now that
it's the
you really
strongest
need.
base. I mean, back then, no one really knew how to defend Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And now it's the wrestling base. You know, takedowns. You have a good ground base, and you have a great takedown defense. So I think that's still one of the stronger elements.
Here's a question for our wrestling fans who have hopefully stuck around. The rumor was when they were not doing too well, banned from pay-per-view and banned from all these states and getting a lot of bad publicity, that of course they were up for sale and the WWF was interested in buying them. Of course, we know once they started having financial problems, guys like Severn and Shamrock, in Shamrock's case going back to wrestling, but Tank Abbott also went to wrestling also. So they kind of had their eyes on this, what's this mixed martial arts thing? And I think it was all Shane McMahon too, because that seems like what he wanted. WWF may have been interested in buying UFC. What if that had happened? Could you even imagine?
We wouldn't be on the show talking about UFC right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have tanked, or hopefully they would have realized what a shit job they would have done and put it up for sale again.
Do you think that it would have been tainted immediately because of the wrestling being fixed?
Exactly.
Well, as soon as a pay-per-view starts and you have Austin cutting a promo about watch this UFC,
Exactly.
it would have been done.
But also, it would have been like awful just to watch it in the sense that they would probably implement pro wrestling into it, like entrances and
I want
music.
that.
I don't want that. And like,
Well,
they
they had entrances.
but you know what I mean? It's just they would have like tried to hook it up a little too much instead of trying to keep it the legitimate sport that it is.
If you look at the WWF's track record of the WBF, the bodybuilding, the XFL, now imagine if they actually had the UFC.
Even their movies, they haven't showed that outside of wrestling that they have done good business-wise.
Exactly.
I guess you were in a theater on May 19th. Back to the old school UFC before we look at a guy who made his name back in the old school UFC. What was your favorite part of old school UFC in the SEG years? Did you have a favorite fighter, moment?
A lot of the stars that came out of there, like Shamrock, Severn, Hoist, Tank Abbott, and my favorite match, most enjoyable match, was a stand-up war between Don Fry and Tank Abbott, fighters of the Ultimate 2. And even though Tank gassed himself out and ended up getting choked out by Don Fry, man, what a battle. And you could see by Don Fry's face, he went to hell and back to get that win.
I think it was under a minute and a half, and what an intense minute and a half
The
it
crowd,
was.
as soon as he hit that left hook, and then Fry went down as at the end.
The very first fight in UFC history, Gerard Godot versus Tila Tula, is a sumo wrestler versus a Dutch savant fighter. Tila comes in to try to take him down. He misses, falls down, and Gerard Godot just kicks him right in the face. Teeth fly past the announcers, and the whole crowd goes, yeah. That's when everybody realized, even Ken Shamrock said in the locker room, everybody realized at that moment, holy shit, this is real. Like, this is like, oh shit.
Needless to say, you have to admire the skill of Hoist Gracie, being 170 pounds and being able to beat and choke out guys much bigger than him, and many times in a night, too, in tournaments. But one of the standout moments for me was when Tank Abbott fought John Matua at UFC 6, the first fight in the tournament. That was one of my first impressions of UFC. 18 seconds later, I was hooked. I was like, holy shit. Not only did he knock this Hawaiian off his feet, this huge hammer fist come down and knocks him unconscious. His limbs are stiff and straight. And even though he went on to lose later that night to Oleg Taktarov, Tank Abbott, one of our guys, this beer gut brawler, still was one of the best heels, let's say, in the old school UFC. Afterwards, asked if he respected his opponent now. Nah, I don't respect anybody. I'm going to go across the bar and get a beer.
When Shamrock came to the WWF and World's Most Dangerous Man, that actually kind of drew me into the UFC. I actually rented one of the tapes and saw him fight, and I was like, oh, damn, this shit is pretty crazy. But it was too raw for me back then.
Well, the main event of UFC 6 that I just mentioned was that big super fight, the first meeting with Severn and Shamrock.
Yeah.
Didn't last nearly as long as their second match, but I love the finish, the guillotine. It was just beautiful.
It was good.
Well, there's lots more, I'm sure, and I hope you've had your comments, too, to old school UFC if you have them, and hopefully if you haven't seen them, you're checking them out now. But we're going to move on to the man who debuted in the SEG years for UFC and just recently retired, the legend, the natural Randy Couture's career when we come back.